Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting and to another collection of horrible fates. In this video, we're going to go over 3 stories of people centuries ago. They all shared very different paths, other than the fact that each of their stories took sudden and violent turns. In each case as well, what they were involved in would go on to have profound impacts on history that are still felt today, but that doesn't make what happened to them any less horrifying. You'll see what I mean, and as always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. There's a story that made the rounds on the internet recently about a famous French chemist known as Antoine Lavoisier. The story goes that he was sentenced to execution by guillotine and he decided to carry out one last experiment before his death. He instructed a colleague of his to watch the ordeal intently and in particular watch his eyes after the guillotine slammed down. Antoine told his colleague he would try his best to blink intentionally to demonstrate that consciousness didn't immediately fade. On the day of the event, something incredibly surprising happened. At least, that is how the story is told. In truth, there seems to be far less and far more to the story than that version. Antoine Lavoisier is often referred to as the father of modern chemistry and is most well known for his law of conservation of mass. He was born into a wealthy Parisian family on August 26, 1743, and in addition to being exceptionally bright, Antoine was always fascinated by the wonders of the natural world. He was also uncharacteristically civic-minded and deeply concerned about the plight of his fellow man. Coming from a family of well-respected lawyers, though, it was almost a foregone conclusion that he'd study law himself. Like his father and grandfather before him, Antoine was eventually admitted to the exclusive order of barristers after graduating from law school. In the end, though, he decided he didn't want to spend the rest of his life in courtrooms and law libraries. What he really wanted to do was dedicate his life to science, helping his fellow man and improving the world around him. During this period of his life, he dabbled in everything from combustion to oxidation while trying to improve air quality and public lighting in the capital city. By all outward appearances, Antoine had become the man of science he always wanted to be, but that changed when his mother died in late 1768. She left the then 25-year-old Antoine a hefty inheritance that he used to purchase a share in an enterprise called General Farm or Farmers General. Farmers General had a government-granted monopoly on the taxation of domestically grown and imported tobacco. The arrangement was so lucrative that Antoine became wealthy beyond his wildest dreams, and over the years, his position took up more and more of his time. When he was 28, he married the 14-year-old daughter of another Farmers General partner named Mary Ann. For a time, they lived comfortable and fulfilling lives, but then they were thrown into turmoil when the revolution broke out in early May of 1789. Sparked by corruption, high taxation, general social inequality, and a financial crisis, the revolutionaries were determined to create a new, more equitable society. And to do this, they had to rid the country of the people and institutions they used to wield and consolidate their power. In other words, people like Antoine and the institutions he belonged to became public enemies almost overnight. And Antoine knew that his status and position of privilege made him a prime target. It also certainly didn't help that he got wealthy collecting taxes from people far poorer than he ever was. Despite this, though, he didn't flee like many of his friends and colleagues. Instead, he saw the revolution as a big opportunity to improve the plight of the very same people who blamed him for the country's problems. In this respect, he was probably a little naive, but true to form, he rededicated himself to scientific work and hoped that reason, common sense, and calmer heads would prevail. But unfortunately, this wasn't the case. The revolutionaries eventually went after Farmers General and the Academy of Sciences. On November 24, 1793, during the aptly named Reign of Terror, he and more than 24 Farmer General members were arrested and charged with defrauding the state. One of the accusations against them was that they added water to the tobacco to make it heavier so they could collect more taxes and line their own pockets. During a short trial, Antoine reminded the court that Farmers General was sanctioned by the former government, that it maintained a consistently high quality of tobacco, and that there was absolutely no proof that any of the allegations were true. But the Revolutionary Court wasn't about to take the word of a wealthy and well-connected tax collector. So in the end, the court found Antoine and his colleagues guilty and sentenced them to death by guillotine. By some estimates, guillotines beheaded nearly 17,000 people during the Revolution. Antoine and his co-defendants were among them, and they were all executed on Wednesday, May 8, 1794. In most respects, Antoine's wasn't any more or less gruesome than anyone else's. According to some hazy accounts, he and a fellow scientist, Joseph Louis Lagrange, came up with a plan to ensure that his death wasn't wasted. The idea was to test whether a severed head retained consciousness for a short period of time. To this end, Antoine apparently told Joseph Louis that he tried to blink his eyes after the beheading to prove that he was still conscious. According to the accounts, his head landed in just the right position to allow Joseph Louis to see his face from the spectator area. And as the story goes, Antoine may have blinked as many as 50 times over the next 30 seconds. Some accounts even claim that Joseph Louis spurred him on by yelling at him to blink. At least, that's the story anyway. However, in reality, although Joseph Louis was apparently there that day, the spectator's area was so far away that he couldn't have been able to see Antoine's eyes blinking even if his head had landed in the right position. In fact, the only people who would have been in a position to see his face so closely were the executioners themselves. It's also worth pointing out that none of the details of the blinking experiment appeared in accounts written at the time of the execution by the people who actually witnessed it. All these stories came years and in some cases centuries later. On top of that, according to eyewitness accounts, Antoine's head actually landed face down in a basket. So where did this story come from, and is there any truth behind it? As for the real blinking story, it apparently did happen at 5:30 in the morning on June 28, 1905, but to a different person. That morning, Dr. Gabriel Bourrier witnessed the beheading of a convicted criminal named Henry Longueuil. According to the doctor, the condemned man was quite calm as he walked toward the guillotine and knelt down, ready for the end. Then a few minutes later, when the guillotine had done its duty, Henry's liberated head came to rest in such a way the doctor clearly saw it from his vantage point nearby. The first thing he noticed was that Henry's lips and eyelids moved and twitched in what he referred to as irregular rhythmic contractions for 5 or 6 seconds. After that, the face relaxed and the eyelids closed about halfway down to the eyeballs, leaving only the white of the eyes visible. Now here's where things get interesting. At that point, the doctor called out Henry's name in a loud, clear voice, and to his surprise, Henry's eyelids rose without any indication that the movement was being caused by random spasms. On this point, the doctor was very clear about what he saw. Next, he claimed that Henry's eyes fixed themselves on his eyes and that he even saw them focus. At that moment, he apparently knew beyond a shadow of doubt that Henry was conscious and that he opened his eyes when he heard his name being called, just like living people do. After several seconds of this, Henry's eyes slowly closed once again. The doctor then called out Henry's name again and his eyelids lifted a second time, but on a third call, the eyes had the telltale glazed look of the recently dead. This well-documented episode lasted less than 30 seconds, and if true, is remarkable. However, with any case that happened over a century ago, and especially ones where there was only a single eyewitness account, take it with a grain of salt. There are a lot of stories about the pioneers and early settlers of the American West. In fact, there are countless tales of the incredible feats they did and the riches they found. But the reality is that traveling across the continent was grueling and could break even the toughest of people. This westward expansion used what came to be known as the Oregon Trail, which was 2,000 miles long and went through what is now Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska, Wyoming, Idaho, and Oregon. It also meant crossing mountains, rivers, and deserts and risking attacks from Native Americans and criminals. But most of those who took the risk believed it was worth it, at least for the most part the men did. For the women, this wasn't as clear. Life for women on the trail in particular could be unbearable. Many were pregnant, or got pregnant, or even gave birth on the trail. And at the time, these women would have had little say in whether they were going, and the best they could do was delay the departure. That's not to say all women saw it as a chore. Quite a few were as excited as their husbands, ready for the new life, but though we can't know for sure, it's likely that Elizabeth Markham wasn't looking forward to the journey. In 1847, her husband Samuel wanted to travel on the Oregon Trail to settle in San Jose, California. This was before the gold rush, but he'd heard the farmland there was excellent and hoped it was the perfect place to settle down. At the time, they had 5 children and another was on the way, and their children would make the trip with them. Before they set off, the journey was carefully planned. Leaving too early meant the livestock might die as the grass dried out, and leaving too late meant they might encounter snow and ice in the mountains. It's unclear where Elizabeth and her family started their journey, but wherever it was, they would have had to buy a lightweight wagon for the trip. These light wagons were known as prairie schooners. They had to be big enough for the food, clothes, and any furniture and equipment the settlers needed, but they also had to be light enough not to get stuck in the mud. And they weren't just for transporting goods either, they would also act as the family's home for months. The start of the journey was also often chaotic, as people fought to be in the best position in the line of wagons, they argued over supplies, and they struggled with their livestock. But soon enough, everyone fell into a rhythm. Each day, the camp would be woken up by a gunshot at 4 a.m. Then fires would be lit and animals milked. Then from 5 to 7, tents and anything else that was brought out for the night would be put away, and then at 7, they'd all set off on the trail. Like most women and girls, Elizabeth would have walked alongside the train. Men typically drove the wagons or rode on horseback, keeping the livestock in line and looking out for any trouble. At midday, they would then stop for food, and any animals and reins or yokes would be relieved. If anyone had caused trouble or broken the law, this was the time to consider their cases and carry out sentencing. Then at 1 p.m. they'd set off again, and Elizabeth would walk all day until the next camping spot was chosen. Most days, they'd only have gone a little further than 15 miles. Then the wagons would be circled, dinner served, and the kids would be allowed to play. Occasionally, musicians might entertain the group while the youth snuck off to get up to mischief. Sometimes there'd be marriage proposals, sometimes fighting. Basically, all of life happened on the trail. And as you might imagine, at 15 miles a day, the Great Plains seemed to go on forever. And for some, the vastness and the wildlife were a marvel, but for others, it was just more of the endless drudgery of the journey, mile after mile of nothing. Elizabeth was initially fascinated by this. She had a telescope and would use it to get a better view of the elk, antelope, and the vast herds of buffalo that went on as far as she could see. On the other hand, the hardships would have been piling up. One of the first things that probably got to Elizabeth was the number of people who were injured or died out on those plains. It was almost as repetitive as anything else, and it was the sound that she remembered. The people screaming in agony after they fell under wheels, came off horses, or one of a million other ways they could lose their lives. Then, not far into the journey, people began to get sick, and often there was no way to help them. The only way to transport them was in the back of wagons, where the temperatures soared as they crossed the plains. When they reached Nebraska, Elizabeth started to think about a man who died there named Hiram Scott. Hiram was a fur trapper who became so ill that his colleagues had no choice but to leave him in the mountains to die in 1828. Afterward, no one knew if he had been killed by animals or died of exposure. Something about his story stuck with her and really bothered her. And as they reached the mountains, things were getting tough for Elizabeth. To her, it felt like they traveled 3,000 miles or more, and it was wearing her down. Once they reached the Snake River, the trails would follow a canyon for 300 miles, and it was here that her grip on reality began to slip. Sometime around this point, she stopped and begged Samuel not to go any further. She just couldn't take it anymore. She eventually broke down and told him that she would stay there and let fate do whatever it wanted to her. In response, in hopes that she would change her mind and continue after him, Samuel continued on, but Elizabeth never caught up. He was eventually worried enough that he sent his oldest son, John, who was 8 years old, to go and get her and bring her to the next camp. Sometime later that night, though, weirdly, Elizabeth showed up, but there was no sign of John. Elizabeth was also acting very strangely and acted like it wasn't weird that John wasn't with her. When Samuel eventually asked her directly about John's whereabouts, she told him as a simple matter of fact that she'd clubbed him to death with a rock. Samuel then took off back to where they were and found John, and the scene was horrific. Thankfully, he wasn't dead, but he was severely injured. It was clear that Elizabeth was telling the truth, or at least she thought she was. She really thought she had killed him. Samuel then brought his son back to their camp, and as he got closer, he realized the fires were more prominent than usual. When he got close enough, he realized the people were trying to extinguish a fire that engulfed a wagon, and soon he realized it was one of his wagons. As he reached his family, Elizabeth turned toward him. Her face was apparently blank except for a slightly smug grin. Elizabeth had set the blaze not long after he'd gone to look for John. Once again, this was apparently her trying to stop them from continuing. Thankfully though, Samuel and the others would manage to put the flames out. Somehow, despite all of this, and this is where the story becomes a bit fuzzy because of the time that's passed, the family got to their destination in Oregon, reaching an outpost near Oregon City in 1847. They then built a store and Elizabeth ran it, and the couple actually had 2 more kids together, although the marriage didn't last much longer after that. Elizabeth was then granted the property in the divorce, and Samuel moved back to California to look for gold. By all accounts, Elizabeth was never the same afterward. Even years after the trip, thoughts of what happened to Hiram Scott in 1828 still haunted Elizabeth. This was so much so that she included it as part of a poem she wrote about the ordeal. She was also said to be tough, possibly abusive to her children. It was also reported that she talked to herself at night, sometimes waking her kids up. She apparently also never showed them any sympathy or love, seeming always distant, and she passed away in 1891 at 100 years of age. She became known as a peculiar old lady, and her obituary was subtitled, "Not in Her Right Mind," in later years. Tragically, Elizabeth was one of many who simply didn't make it across the Oregon Trail in one piece. The 16th and 17th centuries were filled with religious turmoil and disagreement among the English. This eventually led to the splintering of the Roman Catholic Church into 2 different groups and the persecution of a group known as the Separatists, who were viewed as radicals for their beliefs. This eventually forced them to relocate, first to the Netherlands, then after much contemplation and planning, they decided to relocate to the Virginia colony in the New World, near what is now New York City. The move to the New World, however, would be a very difficult one. Because of their low economic status, the Separatists didn't have the money to fund the move themselves, so they turned to financial investors who would provide transportation, tools, clothing, and supplies. In return, however, the investors would employ the Separatists as servants and own all their assets, including land and houses in the New World for 7 years. When time was up, the assets would be divided among the investors and separatists. It wasn't a great deal for them, but it was the only one they had. And there were many disagreements between the investors and the separatists during their business relationship, but despite their friction, the two sides managed to organize and finance the voyage. The separatists were eventually squeezed onto a ship called the Mayflower in September, along with other English colonists, for a total of 102 passengers and a crew of 40 men. History would come to know those 102 passengers as the Pilgrims. Among these passengers were 74 men and 28 women, 31 of which were children. 18 passengers were also listed as servants on the manifest, one of which was a young man named John Howland. Birth records were poorly kept during the time period, and historians disagree on John Howland's exact birth year, but it's believed that he was in his early 20s when the Mayflower departed England. He was a single man and indentured servant of passenger John Carver. His status as an indentured servant meant that John Howland owed a debt to John Carver that was being repaid through servitude. He was treated better than slaves of the time, but he was by no means a free man either. And like the rest of those aboard the Mayflower, Howland endured miserable conditions on the journey. You see, the Mayflower was a merchant ship built to haul wine, lumber, fish, and other goods, not people. There was no consideration for the comfort of anyone on board when it was constructed. So passengers were stuffed below deck in dark, cold, and damp conditions, shoulder to shoulder, and covering every square inch of the Mayflower's internal bottom. And just as the Mayflower wasn't built to carry passengers, it also wasn't built to cross an ocean either. The designers of the Mayflower constructed what they believed would be a suitable ship for short trips along the European coastline, so its design matched its original intention. The Mayflower was bulky, and its square rigging and high compartments would have been a handicap in the middle of the ocean in the best of conditions. Heading directly into the North Atlantic's brutal westerly winds, though, the Mayflower was so outmatched that a full day of sailing could result in negative mileage, which prolonged the trip and intensified the misery of those below deck. After weathering a period of storms to start, the Mayflower found favorable winds and calm weather for a while, but the ship had taken some punishment. An inventory of the ship showed that the intense storms had caused significant leaks in parts of the hull that sat above the ocean surface. It seemed the Mayflower's sails were blown so forcefully that the force pulled pieces of the hull out of place, just enough to cause water to pour in during rough seas and continually soak the passengers below deck. Storms also bent and cracked one of the main beams in the middle of the ship, raising concerns that the Mayflower might not be fit to complete the voyage. Some of the leaders of the Pilgrims even overheard crew members wondering if the Mayflower should turn back, which prompted a discussion between several passengers and the ship's master and officers. During the meeting, some of the officers voiced support for continuing the journey to the New World, likely for the sake of their wages, especially considering they were already halfway across the Atlantic. Others, meanwhile, thought they were needlessly and recklessly endangering the lives of all those aboard if they didn't return to England. After considering all the viewpoints, though, the ship's master asserted that the upper compartments of the Mayflower might be damaged, but the structure below water was strong and secure. With the decision made to continue on as planned, the crew got to work on the repairs in hopes of finishing before the weather inevitably took yet another turn. They managed to complete the task, but none of them anticipated just how much worse the storms would get. When some exceptionally fierce squalls blew in, the Mayflower was unable to withstand even a small amount of its sail hoisted. As a result, the sails were lowered completely during storms, and the Mayflower would sit drifting for as long as it took the storms to pass, sometimes for days at a time. During one particularly nasty storm, John Howland could no longer stand the putrid, soggy conditions below deck, and despite orders to the contrary, climbed the ladder to the deck above. As soon as he was exposed to the elements, John was immediately drenched with rain and seawater, but he didn't seem to notice. He stood there for a moment while the Mayflower tossed and turned in the ocean and filled his lungs with crisp, fresh air for the first time in days. Waves were crashing onto the deck, but John just stood there taking slow, deep breaths. Then, with no warning at all, a wave crashed with its full force into John, throwing him into the Atlantic. With its sails rolled up, the Mayflower's direction was at the mercy of the raging ocean. But even if the ship could have had its sails up in those conditions, no vessel of its size, even today, is able to make a sudden stop and a tight 180-degree turn. And even if it were somehow possible to do this, storm clouds were blocking the moonlight anyway. Seeing anything outside the range of a gas lantern was out of the question, and the sound of the wind and thunder was enough to drown out any shouts. The ocean temperature was also cold enough to kill John within 10 minutes, so before he even hit the water, he was as good as dead. Meanwhile, plunging into the rough waters, John was frantic. His legs kicked and his arms flailed as he fought to keep his head above water. But what happened next could only have been the work of fate. A rope attached to the Mayflower that served to hoist the sails had also gone overboard in the storm and was dragging behind the ship. And as if it were placed by some unseen force, the very end of the rope made contact with the palm of John's hand as his arms thrashed in the water. With milliseconds to react, John closed his hand around the rope and gripped with every ounce of strength he could muster. The uncontrolled speed of the Mayflower in the storm produced a tremendous force at the end of the rope that yanked John almost 10 feet underwater the moment he closed his fingers around it. When he managed to surface, he was quite literally holding on for dear life. Back on the ship, members of the crew who saw John go overboard rushed to the spot where he was tossed in, and seeing the rope completely taut, they grabbed hold of it and began to pull. Several moments later, they were in complete disbelief that John was on the other end of it still. When he was close enough to the Mayflower, they pulled him to safety using boat hooks and sheer adrenaline. Everyone then collapsed to the deck in exhaustion for a moment. And as you might imagine, John was understandably shaken by what just happened, and he was helped back down the ladder into the hull with the other passengers. But although he was safely aboard, John wasn't out of the woods just yet. He was soaked and shaking uncontrollably from the cold. Since they boarded the ship, illnesses had been passed around from passenger to passenger, and the conditions were perfect for John to have returned. And sure enough, John was sick for weeks, but his youth and the care he received from the other passengers allowed him to fully recover. At the time, no one could have predicted what John would do with the rest of his life. But as it would turn out, the impact he would have on the New World and what we know of America today might have been more improbable than escaping certain death in the Atlantic. After the Pilgrims landed in what is today Plymouth, Massachusetts, in November of 1620, after 66 days at sea, John was the 13th person to sign the Mayflower Compact, which was the first governing document of the new colony. When John Carver became the Plymouth colony's first governor, John Howland was put in a position to quickly rise to a position of respect and leadership, despite his initial status as an indentured servant. Then when John Carver passed away in 1621, and his wife shortly after, John Howland was free from his life of servitude and became the head of the Carver household. He was also one of 53 colonists who survived the Pilgrims' first New England winter and attended the colony's first harvest celebration in the New World that autumn. The festival included 90 members of the Wampanoag tribe from a nearby village and would become known to history as America's first Thanksgiving. Then in the years that followed, John would serve on the colony's selectman board and also held positions as assistant and deputy governor, surveyor of highways, and a member of the fur committee. The greatest contribution he made with his second chance at life, though, was fathering 10 children with fellow Mayflower passenger Elizabeth Tilley. Their children would have more than 80 children of their own, and the family tree flourished from there. And here's where things get crazy. Had John died that night in 1620, or from illness the weeks that followed, the ripple effect would have been enormous beyond comprehension. America never would have had presidents Franklin D. Roosevelt, George H.W. Bush, and George W. Bush. Literature would have also been without Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and Ralph Waldo Emerson. Actors Humphrey Bogart, Benedict Cumberbatch, Chevy Chase, Ted Danson, John Lithgow, Christopher Lloyd, and even the Baldwin brothers would have never made contributions to Hollywood. On top of that, if John didn't survive, it's also doubtful his brother Henry would have come to the New World, meaning his descendants, Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford, may have spent their lives as Englishmen instead. And there's no telling how long the list could go on. Since the birth of their first child in 1624, it's estimated that John and Elizabeth are responsible for more than 8 million descendants, more than 2 million of which are still living today. Now, I realize this story is actually the opposite of a horrible fate, maybe more like a miraculous fate, but it's one of those stories that's just so crazy, and this series has always been a bit vague in its groupings, so I included it here anyway. Anyways, if you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the forum found in the description. Also, if you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.